Welcome to Sleepy Centuries, and tonight we will be talking about one of humanity's most awe-inspiring achievements, the story of how we journeyed beyond the sky, to the silent silver world that orbits above us. This is the full story of the moon landing. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin our journey through time, through space, and into history. Before rockets, before engines, before the hum of electricity or the ticking of clocks, there was the moon, hanging silently in the sky, casting its soft silver light over ancient forests, over the seas and deserts, over sleeping villages and watchful eyes. Every civilization, every tribe, every person who has ever lived has looked up at the moon. It was the one constant, the slow, patient witness to all of humanity's beginnings. It pulled at the tides and stirred stories in the minds of poets. People whispered to it, sang to it, marked their calendars by its cycles, and told children that gods, wolves, rabbits, or spirits lived in its glowing face. Long before we had names for gravity or orbits, people knew the moon mattered. They saw it disappear and reappear in regular rhythms. They felt its presence. They feared it, worshipped it, and dreamed of it. It wasn't just a celestial body, it was a companion, a ghostly lantern in the sky, always just out of reach. In Mesopotamia, thousands of years ago, priests carved its shape into clay tablets, tracking the moon's phases to predict floods and guide harvests. The ancient Egyptians built temples aligned with the moon's path. The Chinese wove it into tales of moon goddesses and jade rabbits. The Maya charted its movements with staggering accuracy, seeing patterns across generations and across oceans. Isolated cultures that had never met, Inuit, Polynesians, Druids, Aboriginal Australians, each developed their own myths around the moon, somehow all feeling its pull. It lit the paths of night travelers, stood watch over lovers and warriors, and crept into dreams, a quiet symbol of time and change. Even as science slowly began to pull away from myth, the moon remained more than just a rock in the sky. In ancient Greece, philosophers began to question what it really was. Anaxagoras, around 2,500 years ago, dared to suggest something radical, that the moon might not be divine, but a physical place, lit by the sun, made of earth and rock. He was imprisoned for these thoughts, but the idea had already taken root. A few centuries later, Aristotle and Ptolemy debated the nature of the moon's motion, and though their models were flawed, each question brought us closer to understanding and further from superstition. Then, in the early 17th century, a man named Galileo lifted a simple telescope, just a tube with glass lenses, barely strong enough to see the moon's details clearly, and looked at it with fresh eyes. What he saw changed everything. The moon was not smooth, not divine or perfect as many had thought. It had mountains, craters, shadows that shifted with the sun's angle. It had texture, depth, geography. It wasn't a flawless heavenly sphere. It was a world with a surface you could stand on. This moment, quiet and solitary as it was, marked the beginning of a new dream, that perhaps someday we could go there. Centuries passed, and technology leapt forward. Telescopes grew stronger, mathematics grew bolder. Isaac Newton, in his own quiet brilliance, showed how the moon stayed in its dance around the Earth, caught in a balance between motion and gravity. Astronomers like Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe mapped its motion with greater precision. Writers like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells imagined fantastical machines that could carry men through space. By the late 1800s, the moon was not just a spiritual companion or a subject of science, but a setting for fiction, a place of dreams. People still had no way of reaching it. There were no rockets, no engines that could escape the pull of Earth's gravity. But the moon had started to shift in our minds. It had transformed from a glowing enigma into a destination, from myth to map, from God to goal. The dream of touching the moon had followed humanity across thousands of years. It had weathered wars, plagues, empires rising and falling. Through the darkness of medieval nights to the dawn of telescopic science, the moon was always there. And now, for the first time, it felt like the distance wasn't forever. This idea that humans could leave Earth, travel across 250,000 miles of emptiness and set foot on another world was still impossible. But it wasn't unimaginable anymore. The seed had been planted, and it waited, patient as always, for the moment when someone would finally dare to reach for it. Not in story, not in spirit, but in reality. The 20th century arrived like a storm, roaring with invention and upheaval. It was a time of great hope and even greater destruction. Human civilization was accelerating. Railways stretched across continents. Electricity lit up the darkness. Radios whispered voices from far away. And aircraft, once thought impossible, began to crawl across the skies. The world had never changed so fast, and yet the moon still floated silently above it all, untouched. But what no one knew at the dawn of the century was that the very forces tearing the world apart would soon lay the foundation for leaving it behind. In the 1930s and 40s, as nations braced themselves for global conflict, a new kind of weapon emerged, the rocket. It began as a curiosity, an idea pulled from both engineering journals and science fiction. But it quickly became something far more serious. In Germany, a group of scientists and engineers, led by Wernher von Braun, developed the V2 rocket, a sleek, terrifying machine capable of rising high into the sky and delivering destruction from above. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, and though it was built for war, it did something extraordinary. It reached the edge of space. The V2 broke the invisible boundary between Earth and the cosmos, crossing into the upper atmosphere in a blazing arc, then plummeting back to the ground with deadly precision. Its legacy was soaked in suffering, but its technology would later be reimagined, reworked, and redirected, not towards cities, but toward the stars. As World War II ended in 1945, the world was shattered. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. But amid the ashes, the two remaining superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, turned their eyes not just toward rebuilding, but toward dominance. The Cold War began not with explosions, but with silence, suspicion, and a new kind of race, the race for the future. Both sides understood the power of rockets. Both had captured scientists and plans. The V2, once a symbol of destruction, became a blueprint for something far more ambitious. It was no longer about warheads, it was about orbit. As the Cold War deepened, space became the new frontier of power and pride. It was not enough to have tanks or bombs. Prestige would come from science, from innovation, from reaching farther than anyone had before. Whoever conquered the sky would win not just battles, but minds. And so, quietly at first, then with gathering intensity, the space race began. Laboratories became launch pads, calculations became countdowns. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union sent a message that echoed across the planet, not in words, but in beeps. Sputnik 1, a shiny metal sphere, no larger than a beach ball, became the first human-made object to orbit the Earth. It was simple, just a transmitter sending out rhythmic pings, but those beeps struck fear and awe into millions. For the first time in history, something built by human hands was circling the planet. Looking down from above, the world had changed overnight. The sky, once unreachable, had been breached. The United States, stunned and shaken, responded with urgency. The space race was no longer abstract, it was real, and it had geopolitical weight. Schools refocused on math and science, funding poured into research, and just months later, in January of 1958, the US launched Explorer 1, its own satellite, into orbit. It was the beginning of a fierce technological rivalry, played out not on battlefields, but above the clouds. Both sides launched more satellites. They sent dogs, monkeys, and mice into space, testing the limits of biology and machinery. Each mission, each failure, Each fiery explosion or triumphant launch brought humanity one step closer to a goal that, until recently, had lived only in myth and imagination. Then, in April 1961, the Soviets leapt ahead again. Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old cosmonaut, climbed aboard a tiny spacecraft named Vostok 1 and soared into orbit. For 108 minutes, he circled the Earth, weightless and alone, becoming the first human being to ever leave the world behind. His voice crackled across radios as he gazed down at the planet, a swirling globe of blue and white. When he landed, he was a hero, not just to the Soviet Union, but to anyone who had ever dreamed of touching the stars. Gagarin's flight marked a turning point. Space was no longer the realm of machines. It now belonged to people. In the United States, the response came swiftly. Just weeks later, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and delivered a bold, almost unthinkable challenge that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth within the decade. It was not a promise born of confidence, but of aspiration. At that moment, the United States had only just sent its first astronaut, Alan Shepard, on a brief, suborbital hop. The idea of reaching the moon in less than 10 years seemed impossible. But the impossible, Kennedy argued, was exactly the point. We choose to go to the moon, he declared, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. That sentence lit a fire in the minds of millions. It framed the mission not as a technical objective, but as a test of character. It was a call to action, a national dream, a race not just against the Soviets, but against the limits of human ingenuity. And so the stage was set. From the smouldering ruins of war to the quiet beeps of orbit, humanity had crossed a threshold. The moon, once unreachable and eternal, now stood within the realm of possibility. Rockets born of destruction were being reimagined as ladders to the stars. Scientists, engineers, and astronauts worked tirelessly, often in secret, pushing the limits of physics, materials, and imagination. In classrooms, in control rooms, in wind tunnels and deserts, the groundwork was being laid. The question was no longer if we would reach the moon, but when and how, and who would be the first to leave footprints in its dust. By the time the 1960s dawned, the race to the moon had become more than a contest of engineering. It was a reflection of a world divided. Two superpowers staring across oceans and ideologies, each determined to prove the superiority of their system, not just on Earth, but in the vast, unclaimed territory of space. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer just watching the skies. They were reaching for them with urgency, ambition, and a restless hunger to be first. The moon, once a distant dream shared by all of humanity, had become a prize in a silent war. It was a symbol, a goal, and perhaps most importantly, a way to capture the imagination of billions. The Soviets struck first, again and again. After launching Sputnik and sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit, they achieved another milestone with Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. They launched Luna 2, the first human-made object to crash onto the moon's surface, and Luna 3, which sent back the first blurry photographs of the moon's far side, images no human eye had ever seen. To the world, it seemed the Soviet Union was unstoppable in space. Their launches were shrouded in secrecy, their successes announced only after they had succeeded, their failures hidden or denied. But each triumph sent ripples through the United States, where anxiety turned into determination and hesitation into action. In 1958, the United States had created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, as a civilian space agency with one mission: to catch up and eventually surpass their rival. NASA knew that the moon wasn't just about rocketry, it was about building trust, solving thousands of small problems, training humans to survive in the most hostile environment imaginable, and developing a long-term vision. It wasn't enough to simply launch something into space. To reach the moon, humans would need to understand how to leave Earth, orbit it, navigate across hundreds of thousands of miles of emptiness, land on an alien surface, and come back safely. No one had ever done it. No one even knew if it was possible. So before they could attempt the leap to the moon, NASA took smaller but essential steps. The first was Project Mercury, which began with simple goals: get a man into space, keep him alive, and bring him back in one piece. The Mercury spacecraft was tiny, barely more than a cramped metal capsule with enough room for one person. Inside were switches, wires, and just enough life support to survive the trip. It looked fragile, like a tin can with controls. But Mercury laid the foundation. It proved that humans could withstand launch, survive weightlessness, and operate a spacecraft in orbit. Alan Shepard, the first American in space, made a brief suborbital flight in 1961, followed by John Glenn, who became the first American to orbit Earth in 1962. These missions were short, often under an hour, but they marked the beginning of something larger. They proved that humans could adapt, endure, and function beyond our atmosphere. Still, the moon was far away. Much more would be needed. That led to Project Gemini, NASA's second major effort, and one that is often overlooked despite its enormous importance. Gemini was the bridge, the crucial middle step between Earth orbit and lunar exploration. The Gemini spacecraft could carry 2 astronauts, and each mission tested new capabilities, staying in space for days and weeks instead of hours, practicing rendezvous and docking with other vehicles, and conducting spacewalks where astronauts floated freely outside their spacecraft, tethered only by a thin lifeline. It was during Gemini that NASA learned how to fix problems in real time, how to communicate with ground control over long distances, and how to train astronauts not just as pilots, but as technicians, scientists, and explorers. Every Gemini mission added a piece to the puzzle, building experience not just for the astronauts, but for the teams of engineers, flight controllers, and specialists behind them. Throughout this time, the Soviets remained ahead in many visible ways. Their spacecraft was still setting records. They continued launching new missions, some robotic, some crewed, each a reminder that the United States still had ground to cover. But behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to show. Soviet designs, once revolutionary, were becoming more difficult to scale for lunar travel. Their N-1 rocket, the massive vehicle intended to rival America's Saturn V, suffered repeated failures, often exploding before leaving the launch pad. Internal conflicts, secrecy, and a lack of centralized planning began to slow their progress. Meanwhile, NASA was moving methodically, carefully, with growing confidence. Each success brought new data, new insights, and then, in 1967, a sudden tragedy shook the entire program. During a routine pre-launch test for Apollo 1, a fire broke out inside the command module. Within moments, the capsule was engulfed. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed, trapped inside with no way to escape. The nation was stunned. The mood, once soaring, fell into silence and grief. It was a harsh reminder that space was not just exciting, it was deadly. The investigation that followed exposed flaws in design, communication, and oversight. But instead of bringing the program to a halt, the tragedy led to a deep re-examination. Engineers rebuilt the spacecraft from the inside out. Safety protocols were rewritten. Nothing would be rushed again. The moon was still the goal, but no life would be risked needlessly. The momentum resumed. Apollo missions resumed unmanned tests, followed by increasingly complex crewed missions to Earth orbit. By 1968, Apollo 7 proved the new spacecraft worked as intended. Then came Apollo 8, which, for the first time, carried humans beyond Earth's orbit and around the moon. Astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders became the first people to see the entire Earth as a distant blue marble, hanging in the blackness of space. As they orbited the moon on Christmas Eve, they read from the Book of Genesis, their voices crackling over millions of radios, a message of peace from a place no human had ever reached before. It was a quiet, awe-filled moment, and it marked a turning point. The moon was no longer an idea, It was in sight, in reach, and the path to it had been mapped. With each mission, the United States pulled ahead, mastering the techniques of space travel one by one: docking, navigation, life support, guidance computers, fuel systems, trajectory calculations. It was a symphony of science and engineering, played out with precision and care. The moon landing was no longer theoretical. It was next, and the world was watching. Every broadcast, every newspaper, every classroom felt the weight of what was coming. The question had narrowed to one final challenge. Could we land on the moon, stand upon its surface, and return safely home? And if so, when? The world held its breath. The stage was set. The eagle was waiting. Before any human could set foot on the moon, before the great rocket could rise, and the dust of another world could be disturbed by human boots, an immense amount of work had to be done, quiet, careful, and often unseen. The path to the moon was not a leap, but a long, winding climb made in stages. The Mercury and Gemini missions had shown that astronauts could survive in space, maneuver their vehicles, perform spacewalks, and endure days in orbit. But the moon demanded more, much more. The moon wasn't a few hundred miles above Earth. It was nearly 250,000 miles away, a place so distant that radio signals took over a second to travel each way, a place with no atmosphere, no water, no safety net. Getting there would require a new kind of spacecraft, a new kind of rocket, and an entirely new way of thinking about space travel. And so, the Apollo program was born, not as a continuation, but as a complete reinvention of how to explore the heavens. Apollo was the most ambitious and complex engineering project ever attempted by humankind. It involved over 400,000 people, scientists, engineers, factory workers, coders, mathematicians, designers, seamstresses, metal workers, and more, each contributing a piece to the vast puzzle. The spacecraft itself was a machine unlike anything built before. It had to be strong enough to survive launch, yet delicate enough to land softly on a world with no air. It had to sustain life for over a week, provide power, oxygen, and navigation, and then guide the crew safely back through the fire of re-entry. Apollo was not a single vehicle, but a system made of 3 parts. First was the command module, the only section designed to return to Earth. This cone-shaped capsule housed the crew during launch, flight, and splashdown, packed with controls, computers, life support, and heat shielding. Second was the service module, which remained attached to the command module in flight. It carried the fuel cells, water tanks, engines, and critical systems that made the journey possible. And third was the most fragile and peculiar looking of all, the lunar module. A spindly, angular craft designed only to operate in space, and more specifically, on the surface of the moon. The lunar module looked like it shouldn't fly at all. Its legs jutted out like a mechanical insect. Its gold foil insulation shimmered like something out of science fiction. But inside, it was a masterpiece of efficiency and minimalism. It had 2 stages, a descent stage to land the craft and serve as a launch pad, and an ascent stage to return the astronauts to orbit after their work on the surface was done. It had no seats. Astronauts stood during the landing. Every ounce had to be justified. Every bolt, every wire, every switch was accounted for, because lifting anything into space came at a cost. In spaceflight, weight is everything. But none of these vehicles would go anywhere without a rocket powerful enough to carry them. And so, NASA built the Saturn V, the largest and most powerful rocket ever created. It stood 363 feet tall, taller than a 30-story building, and weighed over 6 million pounds when fully fueled. Its engines could produce over 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, enough to shake the ground for miles around. When it launched, it consumed fuel at an astonishing rate, burning through 15 tons of fuel per second. It wasn't just a rocket. It was a thunderous, fire-breathing tower of raw power, designed to do one thing: leave Earth behind. The Saturn V was assembled in NASA's Vehicle Assembly Building, one of the largest structures ever built. then rolled slowly to the launch pad on a massive crawler, moving at a walking pace. Every launch was a coordinated ballet of timing, weather, fuel, calculations, and human preparation. Training for the Apollo astronauts was just as rigorous and demanding. These were not just pilots. They had to become systems engineers, scientists, survival experts, and masters of improvisation. They practiced inside full-scale mock-ups of the spacecraft, rehearsed lunar surface activities while wearing bulky spacesuits, and spent endless hours in simulators, learning how to handle every emergency, every anomaly. They trained underwater to simulate weightlessness. They learned geology so they could recognize and collect valuable samples on the moon. They practiced parachute landings, desert survival, and ocean recovery. The astronauts of Apollo were pushed to their limits, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. They had to operate with calm under pressure, make decisions in seconds, and place complete trust in the thousands of people behind the mission. Meanwhile, as the hardware and training progressed, so did the missions. Apollo 4, 5, and 6 tested the Saturn V and the command module in unmanned flights. Then came Apollo 7, the first crewed Apollo mission, which flew in Earth orbit and demonstrated the redesigned spacecraft after the Apollo 1 tragedy. Apollo 8 marked a daring leap. It became the first crewed mission to leave Earth's orbit, travel to the moon, and orbit it 10 times before returning home. During that mission, the astronauts witnessed something no human had ever seen: the Earth rising above the lunar horizon. The photograph they took, Earthrise, became one of the most iconic images in history, a reminder of our planet's fragility and beauty. It showed Earth not as a map or a nation, but as a pale, glowing sphere suspended in blackness, all of life, all of history, everything we are, captured in a single frame. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 was a full dress rehearsal, flying to the moon, undocking the lunar module, and descending within just 9 miles of the surface before returning. It proved the systems worked, the maneuvers were sound, and that all that remained was the final step. Years of work, countless hours, thousands of problems solved, and an entire generation of effort had brought humanity to the brink of an entirely new chapter. The technology was ready, the teams were ready, the astronauts were ready. All that remained now was the mission itself, the one that would attempt what no one had ever done: to launch from the Earth, travel through space, descend onto the moon's surface, and come home again. It was time for Apollo 11. On the morning of July 16th, 1969, the world watched with held breath. In Florida, along the edges of Cape Kennedy, thousands of people had gathered, some in silence, some cheering softly, others simply staring skyward, eyes fixed on the towering white column that reached into the sky. This was the moment years in the making, the culmination of tireless effort and sacrifice. Atop the mighty Saturn V rocket sat the Apollo 11 spacecraft, a delicate trio of modules built for one purpose: to cross the void and touch the moon. Inside were 3 men: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, astronauts who had spent their entire careers preparing for this. They were not just pilots, not just symbols of a nation's ambition, but the final link in a chain of invention, determination, and courage, stretching back through centuries. In just a few hours, they would rise through the sky on a column of fire, leave Earth behind, and begin one of the most audacious journeys ever undertaken by humankind. The launch window was precise, the timing down to the second. Spaceflight does not allow for improvisation once in motion. The moon moves, the Earth rotates, and everything must align in perfect harmony. The rocket stood primed, its tanks filled with liquid oxygen and kerosene, supercooled to near freezing. The countdown ticked steadily downward as final systems checks were completed. The crew lay strapped into their couches inside the command module, codenamed Columbia, their suits pressurized, their helmets in place. Below them, engines the size of buildings waited to ignite. And then, as the final seconds slipped away, 10, 9, 8, the engines rumbled to life. At 0, the mighty Saturn V lifted from the launch pad with a slow, almost reluctant grace, as if tearing itself free from the Earth. A thunderous roar followed, rolling across the landscape like a wave. The rocket climbed higher, gaining speed, shedding its stages as it pierced the atmosphere, leaving behind a trail of flame and vapor and the world it came from. Once in orbit, the real work began. The spacecraft, now orbiting the Earth, had to execute a precise series of maneuvers. The upper stage fired again, this time with a burn called TLI, translunar injection. It was this burn that committed the astronauts to the moon, placing them on a trajectory that would take them out of Earth's gravity and into the moon's. There was no turning back from this point. Over the next 3 days, they coasted through space in utter stillness, drifting in the blackness with the stars outside the windows brighter than any seen from Earth. Inside the cabin, they floated in weightlessness, their motions slow and deliberate, their eyes often fixed on the instruments, or peering out toward the moon as it grew larger, more detailed, and more real. Michael Collins remained largely at the helm of Columbia, running systems, maintaining communication with Earth, and preparing for the coming maneuvers. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent hours checking over the lunar module, which had been named Eagle. Folded tightly within the spacecraft, Eagle would soon become their lifeboat and landing vehicle. They rehearsed every movement, every switch, every stage separation in their minds. Procedures were reviewed again and again. Mistakes could not be afforded, not this far from home. The moon, now looming ahead, revealed its surface in shades of grey and white, a cratered, ancient landscape untouched by wind or rain, silent and stark. On July 19th, the spacecraft entered lunar orbit. They circled the moon in a wide arc, staring down at the barren world beneath them. The surface rolled beneath like a slow tide of stone and shadow. They passed over vast plains known as Moriah, over craters with walls hundreds of meters tall, over mountain ranges that rivaled the Alps in height. There was no atmosphere, no haze, no clouds. Every feature was sharp, stark, perfectly visible in the sunlight. The moon had no color, but it was beautiful in its desolation. On the far side, they lost contact with Earth for brief, scheduled intervals, a quiet reminder of how far they had come. When they emerged again, the world listened intently, knowing the time was near. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into Eagle, sealed the hatch behind them, and began the undocking sequence. Collins, now alone aboard Columbia, watched as the lunar module slowly pulled away, its spidery legs glinting in the sunlight, descending toward the moon. He would remain in orbit, circling above, his role just as vital. He was their link home, their only ride back from the lunar surface. Down below, Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for the most dangerous part of the mission, the descent. The lunar module's descent engine fired, slowing their orbit and beginning their fall toward the moon. It was a controlled fall, but one that had to be managed with incredible precision. Unlike on Earth, there was no atmosphere to slow their descent, no drag, only gravity pulling them faster and faster toward the ground. The computer took over much of the work, guiding the craft down. But even computers had limits, and soon alarms began flashing, error codes unfamiliar and unexpected. In Houston, controllers scrambled to interpret the data. It was a problem with the computer's timing system, quickly judged not to be critical. The mission could proceed, but that wasn't the only problem. As Eagle descended, Armstrong peered through the window and saw something troubling. The planned landing site, chosen for its smoothness and safety, was covered with boulders, massive rocks, scattered like ruins across the surface. If they landed there, the lunar module could tip or be destroyed. Armstrong took manual control. His heart rate climbed. With only minutes of fuel left, he searched for a clear spot, eyes scanning the terrain. Aldrin read off altitude and descent rates. Dust began to swirl as they neared the surface. The engine was kicking up a storm of grey particles, making it harder to see. The fuel gauge dropped, seconds now, still falling. Then, the voice crackled through the airwaves, calm, steady, unforgettable. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Cheers erupted in mission control. Across the world, people watching on television or listening by radio shouted, wept, or simply stood in stunned silence. 2 human beings had just landed on the moon. A place that for all of human history had been beyond reach, now had visitors. But the mission wasn't over. Inside Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin ran checklists, ensured the vehicle was stable, and prepared for the next phase, the first human step on another world. They weren't scheduled to exit immediately. Rest was on the schedule first, but neither of them could sleep. Eventually, the decision was made to move forward with the moonwalk. Suits were donned, systems checked again. The hatch opened, a ladder unfolded, and slowly, carefully, Neil Armstrong began to descend. Down the steps, into history. The world waited. A foot reached down. Then it touched. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A man was walking on the moon. Aldrin joined shortly after, calling the lunar surface magnificent desolation. They moved slowly, bounding in the low gravity, learning how to walk in a world that had never known footsteps. They collected samples, took photographs, placed instruments, and planted the American flag, not as a symbol of conquest, but of achievement. They left behind a plaque that read, "We came in peace for all mankind." They stayed on the surface for just over 2 hours, then returned to the lunar module, sealed the hatch, and began preparations to come home. Above them, the moon stretched on in silence. Around them, no wind, no sound, only the slow heartbeat of their suits and the hum of systems designed to keep them alive. They had done what once seemed impossible. They had touched the moon. As Armstrong and Aldrin rested inside the lunar module after their historic moonwalk, the magnitude of what they had accomplished was still unfolding across the world. Newsrooms buzzed, radios played the famous words over and over, televisions replayed the ghostly black and white footage of the first steps on the moon, watched by millions who had stayed up through the night to witness something that had, until now, lived only in dreams and science fiction. Yet while the world celebrated, Armstrong and Aldrin knew their mission was far from over. They had landed safely, but now they had to leave. And in that knowledge lived a quiet, unspoken fear. What if the ascent engine failed? What if they were stranded on the moon? There was no rescue. There was no plan B. They had one chance to return to orbit, to rendezvous with Michael Collins in the command module, and begin the long journey home. Every bolt, every wire, every circuit had to work perfectly. They slept for a few hours in the cramped, angular confines of the lunar module, curled into the narrow spaces available. The cabin was chilly, filled with the scent of metal, dust, and machinery. The lunar dust that clung to their suits had a strange, burnt smell, like gunpowder. Rest came in fits and starts. The suits were bulky. The equipment hummed constantly, and excitement still ran high in their minds. But rest was necessary, and Mission Control advised them to conserve their energy. When the time came to launch from the moon, they prepared the lunar module's ascent stage for ignition. Beneath them, the descent stage would remain behind, acting as a launch pad and permanent monument, while the upper section would carry them back into orbit. The moment was tense, but everything held. At the exact moment required, the ascent engine fired, and the small, angular craft leapt from the moon with a jolt of power and a trail of exhaust that quickly vanished into the vacuum. It rose steadily, tracing an invisible arc above the surface, back toward the waiting command module where Michael Collins orbited alone. For Collins, the hours spent circling the moon were filled with both responsibility and solitude. He was completely isolated, managing the systems aboard Columbia, monitoring the lunar module's descent and activities, and maintaining constant communication with Earth, except during each loop around the moon's far side, where he became the most solitary human in existence. For almost an hour during each orbit, he was utterly cut off. No contact with Houston, no signal from his crewmates on the surface, only the hum of the spacecraft and the sight of stars outside the window. In those moments, he drifted over the hidden face of the moon, a place no human had ever seen until recent years. He looked down on a landscape of jagged craters and long dark shadows, thinking, perhaps, of the line between discovery and danger. He later wrote that he wasn't lonely, but he was aware, deeply aware, of the weight of his role. If anything went wrong during the lunar ascent, he would be the one to return home alone. But the ascent went as planned. The lunar module rose, found its orbit, and closed the distance with Columbia. Docking in lunar orbit was a delicate task. Two vehicles moving at over 3,000 miles per hour had to line up perfectly. The guidance systems, honed through Gemini and previous Apollo missions, did their job. The vehicles met, latched, and the crew reunited. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred the precious lunar samples, the film canisters, and other equipment back into the command module. Then, they sealed the hatch of the lunar module and jettisoned it. The craft that had carried them to the moon, that had sheltered them in the most alien place ever visited, drifted away silently and would eventually crash back onto the surface. Its mission was complete. With all three astronauts aboard Columbia, the next phase began, the return to Earth. The spacecraft had to perform one final burn, known as trans-Earth injection, which would slingshot them out of lunar orbit and set them on a curved path back toward Earth. It was a strange and beautiful thing to watch. The moon slowly shrinking in the distance, the Earth beginning to grow. Out the window, space remained vast and black, the stars unmoving, cold and silent. Inside the capsule, the mood shifted gradually from intensity to reflection. The hardest part had been accomplished. They had flown to the moon, landed, explored, and returned to orbit. Now, with their course set for home, there was time to think, to look out at the Earth as it swelled against the darkness, to consider what had been done. The journey back took 3 days, and during that time, they performed tasks carefully, but also settled into the rhythm of space travel. Meals were eaten from squeeze tubes and pouches, systems were monitored, telemetry was sent back to Earth. But they also laughed, shared quiet moments, and looked down at the blue and white marble that now dominated their view. It was a humbling sight. The Earth, seen from space, seemed peaceful, unified, delicate, a single world without borders, rotating slowly in the void. As they neared Earth, the final challenge awaited: re-entry. The command module was the only part of the spacecraft designed to return. The service module, having served its purpose, was jettisoned, leaving just the small, blunt cone carrying the crew and the precious cargo of moon rocks and film. The capsule had to enter Earth's atmosphere at precisely the right angle. Too steep, and it would burn up. Too shallow, and it would skip off the atmosphere and be lost in space. The angle was narrow, the margin for error slim. But the calculations had been done. The heat shield, engineered to withstand thousands of degrees, held strong as the capsule plunged into the thickening air at over 25,000 miles per hour. A blazing trail lit the sky as the spacecraft decelerated, glowing like a meteor. Then, silence again. Inside, the astronauts felt the rising pressure of gravity returning after days of weightlessness. Parachutes deployed in stages, small drogue chutes to stabilize, then 3 massive main parachutes that unfurled with a slow, graceful flourish. The capsule drifted downward, slower now, the ocean waiting beneath. On July 24th, 1969, the command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, 812 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii. Recovery teams aboard the USS Hornet were already in position, helicopters in the air, divers ready. The capsule bobbed on the waves, scorched and scarred but intact. The mission was over. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins had returned safely, just as promised. They were brought aboard the recovery ship, smiling, exhausted, and immediately placed into quarantine. NASA didn't know what, if anything, the astronauts might have brought back from the moon. It was a precaution born from caution and science. For 21 days, they remained in isolation, tested and observed. The moon, it turned out, held no life, no harmful microbes, But the quarantine was part of the ritual of return. It added a final strange footnote to an already unprecedented journey. When they finally emerged, they were met as heroes. Crowds lined streets in parades. The president greeted them aboard the aircraft carrier. Nations sent congratulations. Around the world, people spoke of the moon landing not as a victory for one country, but as something shared. A moment of awe for all humanity. For a brief time, the divisions of Earth were forgotten. For a moment, everyone looked up at the same moon and knew someone had been there. Apollo 11 had fulfilled its mission, but it had done more than just reach a destination. It had shown what humans could do when driven by curiosity, when united by purpose, when willing to face risks in pursuit of knowledge. It had turned the moon from a myth into a place we had seen with our own eyes, touched with our own hands, and left with footprints and a plaque that read, "We came in peace for all mankind." And now, the moon was not just a light in the sky. It was a memory, a landmark, a promise that even the most distant dreams might someday be reached. It is easy now, decades later, to look back on the words, "The eagle has landed," and feel only their success. To remember them as the triumphant punctuation mark on a mission accomplished, a phrase etched into history and replayed in documentaries, school books, and memory. But in that moment, on July 20th, 1969, those words were not just a milestone. They were a lifeline. They marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another, equally perilous and delicate, surviving on the moon and returning home. Armstrong and Aldrin were now 240,000 miles from Earth, inside a spacecraft no larger than a small closet, parked on an alien surface with no second chances. The terrain beneath them was dusty and uneven, the light sharp and colourless, and outside, beyond the thin walls of the lunar module, stretched a silence so total it could only be found in a place untouched by weather, time, or life. Their first moments after landing were filled with procedure. They had to shut down the engine, check pressure levels, monitor fuel reserves, ensure that their fragile craft had not been damaged during the landing. The lunar module sat still, resting on its spider-like legs in a shallow crater within the sea of tranquility, surrounded by grey dust and scattered rocks that had not moved in millions of years. Nothing here changed. There was no wind to blow the dust, no water to smooth the stone. Even their descent, though delicate, had kicked up a storm of lunar dust, fine, powdery, and clinging to every surface it touched. Through the windows, Armstrong could see the lunar horizon stretching low and far, not curved like Earth's, but near and unfamiliar, as though he had landed on a vast stage built for a scene with no audience. Back on Earth, the world waited, still and breathless. The broadcast feeds had gone silent for a time. Reporters and technicians leaned in towards screens and radios, waiting for updates. And then, the confirmation came through. The Eagle was down, alive, whole. Mission Control in Houston erupted in restrained celebration, cheers quickly falling into a calm focus, because they too knew what still remained. This was only the middle of the story. They had landed, but would they return? For the astronauts, every minute was accounted for. Once systems were confirmed stable and the craft deemed safe, Armstrong and Aldrin were given time to rest. Sleep was encouraged, but unsurprisingly, it did not come easily. They floated between tasks, rehearsals, and rest periods, running down their checklists, communicating with Mission Control, and looking out onto the ancient, lifeless plain that surrounded them. The surface of the moon was not black and white, as some might have imagined, but a muted, pale grey, with subtle tones depending on the angle of the sun. Long shadows cut across the ground. The sun, unfiltered by atmosphere, burned in the sky like a bare bulb, casting stark, unblinking light across the regolith. There was no twilight here, no breeze, no noise. Every movement, every action took place in an environment that had remained unchanged for eons. Eventually, the decision was made to begin the moonwalk earlier than scheduled. Neither astronaut could sleep. The anticipation, the adrenaline, the sheer weight of the moment was too great. Preparations began. Putting on the suits was a complex and time-consuming task. The suits were bulky, stiff, made for survival in a place where no air existed, where the temperatures could swing from scorching heat to frozen silence. They carried life support systems on their backs, portable spacecraft in themselves. Everything had to be sealed. Every latch double-checked, every wire and valve confirmed. There could be no leaks, no faults. If anything failed once they were outside, they would be on their own. Armstrong was the first to exit. He moved slowly, carefully backing through the narrow hatch of the lunar module. There was no graceful way to do it. He climbed down the ladder, step by cautious step, until only one more remained. The final foot hovered, then dropped. Contact. His boot pressed into the moon's soft, powdery surface. It did not compress like sand, but held its shape, strangely dry, cohesive, as if made from some forgotten material. And then the words came, carefully spoken, but destined to echo through time. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Armstrong's footstep marked the first direct human imprint on another celestial body. A step not taken by accident, but by design, across centuries of observation, decades of research, and years of focused effort. It was a step into history, but also into the unknown. Soon after, Aldrin joined him on the surface. He described the scene with the words magnificent desolation, a perfect paradox. It was barren, lifeless, untouched, and yet astonishing in its quiet grandeur. The two astronauts moved slowly, adjusting to the moon's gravity, which was 1/6 of Earth's. They hopped and shuffled, experimenting with balance, learning how to walk again. They carried out their tasks with the focus of trained professionals, but could not help the occasional pause to take it all in. They planted the American flag. Though it didn't wave, it couldn't, not without air. It stood, supported by a horizontal bar, a quiet symbol rather than a boast. Near it, they placed a plaque on the leg of the lunar module, bearing a simple message. Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969, AD, we came in peace for all mankind. They deployed experiments designed to measure seismic activity, solar wind, and reflect laser signals from Earth. They gathered samples of lunar rock and soil, filling bags and containers with material that would be analysed for decades. They took photographs of the landscape, of each other, of the Earth hanging in the sky like a fragile marble far away. Time moved quickly. Their moonwalk, though historic, was tightly timed. They could not stay outside long. Every breath of oxygen, every watt of power, every step was rationed. After about 2.5 hours, they made their way back to the lunar module, brushing dust from their suits, climbing the ladder once more and sealing the hatch behind them. Inside, they began the process of repressurization. They removed their helmets, gloves, and backpacks, stowing samples, recording observations. Outside, the footprints they had left remained perfectly intact. No breeze would erase them. No rain would wash them away. They would endure, possibly for millions of years. Their short walk had made them the most famous travelers in history, and the only two among billions who could say they had walked on another world. As they rested in preparation for the return launch, the moon remained as it had always been, cold, quiet, ancient. The surface they had touched was older than any civilization, unchanged for longer than memory itself. And now, for the first time, it had borne the weight of human presence. Their time on the moon was brief, but its meaning stretched far beyond minutes and miles. It was a beginning, not an end. A whisper to the universe that we had arrived, not to conquer, not to claim, but simply to be there, to see, to know, to remember. When Armstrong and Aldrin completed their moonwalk and returned to the safety of the lunar module, the Eagle once again became a fragile oasis in the dead stillness of space. They were dusty, tired, their bodies stiff from moving inside pressurized suits, their minds still reeling from the sheer intensity of what they had just done. There had been no time to truly reflect while walking on the moon. It had been all precision, all action, each movement governed by time, checklists, and oxygen levels. But now, inside the lunar module, there was at least a moment to breathe. The silence outside remained absolute. No wind howled beyond the thin metal walls. No birds sang. There was only the hum of life support systems and the soft clunk of tools being stowed, samples being packed, switches being flipped. Even with the glow of accomplishment, the men were still aware that they were 250,000 miles from home, and their journey was far from over. They carefully stored the lunar soil and rock samples, sealing the bags and containers, labeling everything with meticulous care. These materials were priceless, not because of what they might be worth, but because of what they could teach. Each handful of dust, each chunk of ancient rock, was a piece of the moon's history, untouched by erosion, preserved in the vacuum of space since long before Earth had cities or oceans full of life. Some of those rocks had rested in that very spot for billions of years. Now, they would be studied by geologists, physicists, and chemists across the world, offering clues about the origins of the moon, the early solar system, and perhaps even Earth itself. As they prepared for sleep, Armstrong and Aldrin tried to find comfort in the small, cramped module. It wasn't easy. There were no beds, no soft surfaces. They slept in their suits, partially upright, suspended in the lunar module's delicate frame, like two explorers inside a tent, pitched on a cliff's edge. The moon's surface outside remained unchanged, still bathed in harsh, silvery light. The stars hung steady and cold in the sky. And just above the horizon, the Earth rotated in full view. A brilliant sphere of blue, white and green, so distant, and yet the only home they had ever known. Sleep, when it came, was light and fragmented. Every sound within the cabin, every hiss of air, every tick of a system, was a reminder of where they were and what depended on every circuit continuing to function. Back on Earth, people were still wide awake. Across continents and time zones, televisions flickered into the early hours, radios repeated Armstrong's words, and newspapers rushed to print fresh headlines. For a brief, shining moment, the divisions of the world seemed to pause in cities and villages, in war-torn regions and peaceful suburbs. People looked up at the moon and realized that two men were standing, or had stood, on it. The impossible had become reality, and even though the mission had not yet ended, the world had already been changed. Eventually, the time came to leave the moon. The Eagle had to rise. Armstrong and Aldrin went through the final checklists, ensuring the ascent engine was ready. It was a moment laced with silent anxiety. The ascent engine had never been fired before on the moon. There was no backup. If it failed, the two astronauts would be stranded. There would be no rescue. Their fate would be to remain on the moon, alone and unreachable. Their story told not just as heroes, but as martyrs to human ambition. But the engine held. With a blast of light and force, the upper stage of the lunar module tore free from the descent stage left behind and began climbing back into orbit. There was no dramatic sound, no roar, no rumble, only the thrust of the engine and the sudden movement as the surface of the moon began to fall away beneath them. Michael Collins, patiently orbiting above in the command module Columbia, was waiting. He had spent more than 20 hours alone, circling the moon, the only human not on or near the surface. His task had been quiet, but essential. Monitoring systems, running calculations, preparing for the rendezvous. As Eagle rose, the two spacecraft began the careful ballet of orbital docking. Despite the distance, despite the complexities of orbital physics, everything proceeded with practiced precision. The lunar module, guided by its tiny engine and Armstrong's steady hand, approached Columbia. The two craft locked together and the crew reunited. There was no ceremony, no grand speech, just the relief of seeing each other again. The unspoken acknowledgement that the most dangerous part of the mission had passed. The astronauts transferred the samples and gear from Eagle into Columbia. Then, with the press of a button, the ascent stage of the lunar module was released, left to orbit the moon or crash silently onto its surface in time. It had served its purpose and now joined the growing list of forgotten machines in space, sacred relics of a journey completed. The crew of 3 was whole again. The final phase awaited, returning to Earth. They performed a final burn to break free of the moon's gravity and begin the journey home. It would take 3 days to cross the void. During that time, the command module coasted smoothly, rotated to maintain balance, and was gently guided by the subtle pull of Earth's distant gravity. Inside, the astronauts carried out small tasks, logged observations, and gazed at the growing planet ahead. Earth was now larger than the moon, a swelling blue marble streaked with white clouds, bright and alive. Looking back towards the moon, it was harder to imagine that just days before, they had been walking on its surface. It already seemed distant, otherworldly, like a half-remembered dream. As they approached Earth, preparations were made for re-entry. The service module, having provided power, oxygen, and propulsion during the trip, was jettisoned. Only the command module remained, heat-shielded, compact, and shaped to withstand the inferno of re-entry. It was the only part of Apollo 11 that would return to Earth. The angle had to be perfect. The atmosphere was unforgiving, too steep, and the capsule would burn, too shallow, and it would skip off the atmosphere like a stone across water. But the calculations were sound. The guidance systems performed flawlessly. As they entered the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere, the spacecraft glowed red-hot, flames licking across the shield, plasma forming in a halo as it slowed from over 25,000 miles per hour. The parachutes deployed just as designed. First the drogues, then the main chutes, 3 massive canopies that billowed out above the Pacific Ocean. The capsule slowed to a gentle descent, and finally, with a splash and a spray of water, it returned to the planet it had left just over a week before. Navy recovery teams were waiting. Divers approached, secured the capsule, and helped the astronauts into a life raft. Moments later, they were hoisted aboard the USS Hornet. President Nixon was there to greet them through the quarantine window, smiling and waving as the crew grinned from behind the glass, tired, unshaven, but alive. They had done it. They had traveled through space, landed on the moon, walked upon its surface, and returned, safely, as promised. For the next 21 days, they remained in quarantine as a precaution against unknown lunar contaminants. It was a strange footnote to the most incredible mission in history. Heroes in isolation, watched through glass, studied by scientists, and celebrated by a world that had never needed so much to believe in something larger than itself. And yet, for all the parades and headlines, the astronauts remained humble. They spoke often of the people behind the mission, the thousands who had worked, calculated, soldered, designed, and dreamed. They had done something extraordinary, yes, but they knew they had done it not alone, but as the representatives of humanity's shared desire to explore, to understand, to reach out into the darkness and find a new shore. Apollo 11 had not just landed on the moon, it had landed in the hearts and minds of people everywhere. It had shown what could be done with courage, unity, and imagination. And even as they stepped off the aircraft carrier and into the next chapter of their lives, the echoes of their journey would ripple outward forever, whispering that the sky was never the limit, but only the beginning. After Apollo 11 returned to Earth and the crew completed their quarantine, the celebrations began in earnest. They were met by presidents, honored in parades, given medals and awards from countries around the world. The streets of New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles filled with confetti and cheers as the 3 astronauts stood atop motorcades, waving down at seas of people who looked up in awe. It wasn't just about patriotism, it was deeper than that. It was wonder, reverence, a sense that something timeless had just taken place. They were not simply national heroes, they were symbols of possibility. For a brief moment, the divisions of the world felt smaller. Children pointed at the sky with new dreams. Scientists looked toward new questions. Artists painted moonscapes, and engineers sketched new rockets. The moon was no longer unreachable. It had been touched, and now it belonged not just to the heavens, but to human history. But NASA knew that the mission could not end there. Apollo 11 had proven it could be done, but it was only the beginning of what the program aimed to achieve. There were still so many unanswered questions. The moon's surface had been barely explored, touched only for a few short hours in one location. Its composition, its history, its place in the formation of the solar system, these were mysteries waiting to be unraveled, and so the missions continued. Apollo 12 launched just 4 months later in November 1969, carrying Charles Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon. This time, the mission had more confidence. The crew's goal was to demonstrate pinpoint landing capability, and they did just that, touching down within walking distance of the unmanned Surveyor 3 probe that had landed 2 years earlier. The astronauts not only gathered new samples, but brought parts of Surveyor 3 back to Earth, where scientists could study the effects of the lunar environment on man-made equipment. The mission showed that Apollo was not a one-time event, but a repeatable, evolving program, one with science at its heart. With Apollo 13, the dream nearly shattered. Launched in April 1970, the mission was intended to explore a new region of the moon. But 2 days into the journey, an oxygen tank exploded inside the service module, crippling the spacecraft. The phrase, "Houston, we've had a problem," entered the public consciousness with a chill. What followed was one of the greatest displays of problem-solving and teamwork in the history of spaceflight. The mission shifted instantly from exploration to survival. The crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, took refuge in the lunar module, using it as a lifeboat. NASA engineers worked around the clock to devise emergency procedures, jerry-rigged filtration systems, power conservation plans, and a revised trajectory to bring the astronauts home safely. The world held its breath as the crippled spacecraft looped around the moon and returned to Earth. When the parachutes deployed and the capsule splashed down, it felt like a second triumph, different from a moon landing, but just as human. It reminded everyone that space was still dangerous, still filled with risk, and that even a small failure could tip the balance between glory and disaster. Apollo 14, launched in early 1971, was NASA's way of returning to form. Alan Shepard, the first American in space, finally reached the moon. He and Edgar Mitchell explored the Fra Mauro region, conducting geological studies and setting up new instruments. The mission proceeded smoothly, though not without its own challenges, including docking difficulties and technical glitches. But Shepard, ever the showman, became famous once again by hitting 2 golf balls on the lunar surface, an image both surreal and oddly human. Beneath the novelty, though, was deep science. Apollo 14 brought back more than 90 pounds of lunar material, contributing significantly to what we know about the moon's composition. Then came Apollo 15 in July 1971, a mission that marked a turning point. This was the first J mission, designed for extended exploration. It featured a longer stay on the surface, and for the first time, a new piece of equipment that changed everything: the Lunar Roving Vehicle. The Lunar Rover, a folding, battery-powered car, allowed astronauts David Scott and James Irwin to travel far from the lander, covering nearly 17 miles across varied terrain. They climbed slopes, examined craters, and gathered samples from regions previously out of reach. They discovered the Genesis Rock, a piece of ancient anorthosite believed to date back over 4 billion years, offering a window into the early formation of the moon's crust. Meanwhile, Alfred Worden, orbiting above in the command module, conducted experiments and took high-resolution photographs of the lunar surface, mapping it in unprecedented detail. Apollo 15 showed what lunar science could truly achieve when time, tools, and experience were on the astronauts' side. Apollo 16, launched in April 1972, ventured into the lunar highlands, a region more rugged and geologically complex than previous sites. Astronauts John Young and Charles Duke navigated steep, dusty slopes and collected over 200 pounds of lunar rock, while Thomas Mattingly conducted orbital science above. The mission pushed the limits of the rover and tested the astronauts' ability to work in harsh, unpredictable terrain. The The samples they returned added important diversity to the lunar collection, showing that the moon was not as uniform as once thought. Variations in mineral composition, age, and structure hinted at a more dynamic lunar history than anyone had anticipated. And then came Apollo 17, the final lunar mission. Launched in December 1972, it carried the first and only professional geologist to the moon, Harrison Schmitt, alongside Commander Gene Cernan and Command Module pilot Ron Evans. With a longer surface stay and more advanced experiments, Apollo 17 became the high watermark of lunar science. Schmitt's expertise brought new depth to sample collection, with the crew exploring the Taurus Littrow Valley, a region chosen for its geological richness. The rover carried them across boulder fields and ancient lava flows. They brought back over 240 pounds of samples and installed sophisticated instruments designed to study the moon's interior and its interactions with the solar wind. Cernan, the last to leave the surface, paused before climbing the ladder and offered a few quiet words to history, saying, "As we leave the moon, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return with peace and hope for all mankind." And then the moon grew silent once more. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were planned but cancelled, cut from the budget as public interest waned and the cost of exploration rose. By the end of 1972, the program had shifted focus. Skylab, Earth orbit, and later, the space shuttle would become NASA's priority. But the footprints remained. The 6 missions that had landed, the 12 men who had walked on the moon, the equipment left behind, the flags and tools and rovers, all of it still rests there, untouched, preserved by the vacuum, by the stillness of a world without weather. The moon had become not only a place we had visited, but a place we had studied, measured, and come to understand in ways previously unimaginable. Yet for all the success, there was a quiet sadness that followed Apollo 17. The end of the missions was not just a shift in policy, it was the closing of a chapter. The moon landings had brought people together, inspired generations, expanded knowledge, but they had also been born of urgency, of Cold War competition, and when that urgency faded, so too did the political will to keep going. Still, what had been accomplished could not be undone. The story of Apollo was not only written in data or samples, it was written in memory, in imagination. For the children who watched from classroom TVs, for the engineers who dreamed of new missions, for the world that looked up at the night sky and saw more than a glowing light, it was proof that with enough courage, enough vision, and enough determination, humanity could take a dream and place it, quite literally, among the stars. Long after the last lunar module lifted off and the final Saturn V rocket thundered into the sky, the moon remained, just as it always had, quiet, cold, and suspended in the eternal darkness beyond Earth's atmosphere. But something had changed. For billions of years, the moon had orbited untouched, watched by ancient civilizations, imagined by poets, mapped by astronomers. Then, for a fleeting moment in the 20th century, it became a destination. It bore witness to the footsteps of 12 human beings, the imprint of tires from a rover designed to fold and unfold in a vacuum, the flutterless hanging of 6 national flags, and the soft gleam of instruments left behind to record the environment of a world no longer untouchable. And even after the missions ended, after the parades quieted and the television broadcasts faded into memory, the echoes of those journeys remained, etched not just into the dust of the lunar regolith, but into the shared memory of an entire species. The remnants of Apollo still rest there, untouched by time. The footprints are as crisp as the moment they were made. The marks left by boots and wheels have not faded. Without atmosphere, without wind or water, without seasons or storms, the moon preserves what Earth cannot. Time behaves differently there. Decay comes not with erosion, but only with the occasional silent impact of a meteorite. The flags, though now bleached by solar radiation, still stand. The descent stages of the lunar modules remain like monuments, faded gold foil and skeletal ladders. silent machines resting in the shadow of distant crater walls, and somewhere near them are the golf balls Alan Shepard hit, the family photos left by astronauts, the handwritten notes, the small mementos of Earth carried across space for reasons as human as curiosity, pride, and love. For decades, no human returned. Apollo 17 had been the final mission. The grand lunar ambitions gradually gave way to more modest programs focused on Earth orbit, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station. They offered new lessons, new technologies, new kinds of science. But the moon remained still, waiting like a distant relative left unvisited, remembered only in stories and old photographs. Yet it never left us. It rose every night, unchanged in its path, always watching, always reminding. Generations grew up having never known a time before moon landings. Children born after Apollo learned about it in textbooks and documentaries, often surprised to hear that humans had once walked on the moon, but no longer did. For some, it seemed almost unreal, a piece of history too big to fully grasp. For others, it became a challenge. Why had we gone? And why did we stop? Still, the influence of the moon landings spread in subtle and lasting ways. Entire careers in science and engineering were inspired by a blurry image of Neil Armstrong stepping onto a dusty surface. Technological advancements, driven by the space race, filtered into daily life. Computer miniaturization, satellite communication, materials science, medical devices, and far beyond the hard edges of hardware and code, there was something else, something quieter, but equally vital, a shift in perspective. The famous photographs taken by Apollo astronauts, Earthrise, the blue marble, the endless horizon of the lunar plains, reshaped how people thought about their home planet. For the first time in history, humanity had seen itself from afar, a fragile orb suspended in blackness, with no visible borders, no sign of conflict, only swirling clouds and the curve of oceans. That image, more than any flag or rock sample, may be the greatest legacy of Apollo. As the years passed, talk of returning to the moon ebbed and flowed. Plans were drawn up and shelved. Budgets changed, administrations shifted focus, and space exploration evolved into a slow, steady rhythm, rather than the fiery sprint of the 1960s. But the moon remained there, close and yet distant, always visible, always reachable, if only the will returned. And quietly, steadily, the idea of going back began to stir again, not just to visit, but to stay. The dreams that had been paused began to rekindle. Scientists envisioned lunar observatories peering deep into space from the moon's far side, free from Earth's atmospheric interference. Engineers designed habitats that could sustain life in harsh environments. Explorers talked of building bases, mining water ice in the lunar poles, growing food in underground greenhouses. Some even spoke of using the moon as a stepping stone to Mars, a practice ground for journeys even more distant. Meanwhile, robotic missions continued. NASA, the European Space Agency, China, India, and private companies sent probes, landers, and orbiters to study the moon with precision. They mapped its surface in exquisite detail, discovered ice hidden in shadowed craters, and identified regions that could one day support human outposts. China's Chang'e missions returned samples, deployed rovers, and landed on the far side of the moon, a first in human history. The moon, once visited by astronauts in bulky suits and analog equipment, was now being scanned by robots with artificial intelligence and lasers. The exploration never truly stopped, it simply evolved. And then, quietly, a new generation began to dream aloud. Programs like NASA's Artemis emerged with a new goal, not just to return to the moon, but to return differently, to build, to include more of humanity, to send not only men, but women, to involve not just one nation, but many. This time, the moon would not be the end of the story, but a beginning, a gateway to deeper space, to Mars, to the stars. The rocket designs returned, now taller and more powerful. New capsules emerged, echoing Apollo in shape, but powered by advanced computing and materials undreamed of in 1969. And the names returned too: Orion, Gateway, Artemis. Names taken from myth and memory, pointing back to the moon, but forward to what lies beyond. Yet despite the changes, despite the new machines and missions and dreams, the core feeling remained the same. It was the feeling that had always followed the moon. That quiet sense of wonder, that tug at the imagination, the belief that, for all our flaws, all our struggles, human beings were still capable of greatness, that we could look up at a distant light in the night sky, decide to go there, and make it real. The moon had not changed, but we had. And now, as plans take shape to return, as new astronauts are named, as fresh hardware is tested, the legacy of Apollo feels less like a relic and more like a foundation. The footprints are still there, waiting, untouched, unmoved, silent reminders that we were once bold enough to try. And as you lie there, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, listening to the story of the moon landing unfold like a gentle echo from the past, let that thought linger, that in all of Earth's long, wild history, in the billions of years it has turned under the sky, there was a time, just a brief moment, when creatures born of stardust reached back into the heavens and touched the world that watched over them. A time when rockets climbed and dreams took flight and the moon welcomed its first visitors, and perhaps will one day welcome them again.